They say time heals all wounds. But I think time a liar with beautiful manners. What it actually does is teach you how to arrange the wreckage so neatly that people mistake it for a life. I waited 50 years for Alessandro Morelli to walk back through my doors and
I understood something that broke me open. If this broke something open in you, subscribe. Tell me where you are watching from so the next story finds you before you've waited too long. So someone else doesn't have to learn this lesson alone. My name is Claudette Monroe, and I have never simply entered a room. At 70, I arrive, the way a storm front arrives, slow and inevitable, before anyone thinks to close the windows. Tonight I wear burgundy velvet, the color of old wine and older wounds, and then my silver charcoal curls are swept to one side, like a crown that time itself shaped and set. From a distance I imagine I look like a woman who has everything arranged exactly as she intended. From the inside, I am a cathedral that forgot to have a congregation. Let me take you somewhere first, away from this chandelier gilded ballroom, away from the low hum of conversation and the scent of someone else's perfume. Take me back to the summer of 1974, to the Italian coast where the heat pressed against your skin like a second body, and the air tasted of salt and espresso and the particular recklessness of being 20 years old, and certain you have found the only love that will ever matter. That was where I found Alessandro, or perhaps where he found me. It was always difficult to tell with him, to the way a tide doesn't ask the shore for permission. He had dark, unruly hair that he never quite tamed, and eyes that didn't just look at you. They recognized you, as though they had been searching for some time, and were quietly relieved to be done. His voice was low, smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who understood that the right word said slowly lands deeper than 1,000 rushed ones. He made promises the way Italians sometimes do, not carelessly, but with such complete conviction that you never think to ask for a contract. You simply believe. You rearrange your whole interior life around the believing. He left that autumn back to Italy, with 6 months on his lips and 50 years of silence in his wake. And I did what women like me are so dangerously good at. I waited. I dressed beautifully. I grew graceful and composed and quietly devastating. I became, over half a century, the most exquisite version of a woman, standing very still. And tonight, when I heard his name on the guest list, I told myself I was finally about to be rewarded for all of it, for the patience, for the preservation, for the devotion that outlasted every reason to keep it. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. The summer of 1974 smelled like warm stone and overripe figs, like sunscreen that hadn't quite dried, and the particular sweetness of a country that has never apologized for being beautiful. I was 20. I wore white linen and too much hope, and I had no idea that the next 8 weeks would become the architecture of the rest of my life. Alessandro found me at a terrace cafe in Positano, where the hillside tumbles toward the sea like it simply gave up resisting. He was already at the railing when I arrived. Dark hair catching the wind, collar open, completely unbothered by how devastating he looked. That was the thing about him. He never performed it. He turned, and those eyes found mine with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been expecting me. 3 weeks later, under a moon so low it felt borrowed, he took both my hands and said, slowly, deliberately, the way he said everything that mattered, I will come back for you. This is not a goodbye. This is only a pause. I believed him completely. I have been living inside that pause ever since. The 1980s were a decade of proposals. They arrived the way seasons do, predictably, one after another. Each man convinced he was the exception to a rule he hadn't yet learned existed. There was a diplomat with silver cufflinks who took me to Geneva and mistook my composure for availability. A sculptor in New Orleans who said I had a face that deserved to be preserved in stone, as though I hadn't already done that to myself. A kind architect from London who wept quietly and with great dignity when I said no. I respected that one. I almost felt something. Almost. And then there was Michael. Michael Monroe did not arrive with theater. He arrived with patience, the rare, unhurried kind that doesn't announce itself. He was steady in the way old oak is steady, not dramatic, not dazzling, but deeply, unmovably there. His voice was low and unhurried, and when he spoke, he chose his words the way a careful man chooses his steps on uncertain ground. He saw through my armor, not by force, but by simply refusing to pretend it wasn't there. "You love someone else," he said one evening, not as an accusation, as a fact he had quietly made peace with. "I know. I'm asking you anyway." I said yes. I wore ivory. I meant every word I spoke at that altar, every word that was mine to give. Michael deserved that, and I gave it fully. But there was a room inside me I never unlocked for him. A small, airless room with a Mediterranean summer pressed behind its door like a photograph kept face down in a drawer. He never asked me to open it. Perhaps he knew better. Perhaps that was its own kind of love. I told myself that was enough. For a long time, I almost believed it. I married Michael Monroe in the spring of 1981, 7 years after Alessandro left, and I want to be honest about something that has cost me greatly to admit. Michael was a good man, perhaps one of the finest I have ever known. He built a life around me the way a master craftsman builds a frame, with care, with precision, with the quiet hope that what he was holding would eventually settle into it and call it home. I never did, not fully. I was present for all of it. The townhouse with the amber-lit kitchen, the dinners where I laughed at the right moments, the vacations where I stood at the water's edge looking beautiful, and somewhere else entirely. I gave Michael my time, my fidelity, my considered affection, what I could not give him, what I had already spent long before he arrived, was the unguarded version of myself, and the one that existed before I learned to carry grief like a finishing accessory. People admired us. They said we were elegant together. What they were seeing, I think, was the architecture, the polished surface of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. They could not see that I was always in some interior room no one else had a key to, looking past Michael's shoulder, not at another man in the room, at a version of him that might have had dark, unhurried eyes and spoken with the slowness of someone who understood the weight of a promise. Michael died never knowing he had been loved, genuinely, tenderly, by a woman who was also simultaneously haunting a different life. That is the cruelty I have to live with. Not what Alessandro did to me, what I, in my devotion to a ghost, quietly did to a man who deserved the whole of me. And the doctor used the word pancreatic the way people use words they hope you won't fully hear. I heard it. Michael heard it. And then we both looked at the white wall behind the doctor's head, because some truths are too large to meet directly in the eye. Michael Monroe was a good man, not in the pallid, unremarkable way people mean when they've run out of things to say at a funeral, but genuinely, structurally good, the kind of good that shows up at 2 a.m. without being asked. He loved me with a steadiness I never deserved and never quite returned, and somewhere beneath my composure, I had always known that. The disease hollowed him slowly. First, the color left his skin, that warm amber tone bleaching into something translucent and strange, like old paper held to the light. Then the weight. Then the laugh that I had taken for granted for 31 years. I cared for him with every ounce of dignity I possessed. I bathed him. I held his hand through the contractions of pain. I sat beside him in the dark, and I was present. In every way except the one that would have mattered most to him. Even then, even at the very edge of his life, some quiet, shameful chamber of my heart was still furnished for someone else. I saw him before he saw me, and for one suspended breath, I wished it had stayed that way. He was standing near the far edge of the room, a glass held loosely in one hand, silver hair brushed back, and slightly rebellious at the temples, as though even now, at 70, some part of him refused to be fully composed. The years had not diminished him. They had simply distilled him, in the way long aging clarifies rather than corrupts. He was still beautiful, terribly, uselessly beautiful. Then he turned, and those eyes, dark, unhurried, heavy with something nameless, found me the way they always had, not by searching, by simply arriving. Claudette? My name in his mouth. Low, smooth, unmistakably Italian. Once that sound had been the closest thing I knew to shelter. Now it reached me like a voice calling from a house that had long since burned down, familiar in shape, hollow at the center. I smiled, the way you smile at a ghost who doesn't yet know he is one. He spoke about her the way people speak about weather from a year they barely remember. Her name was Sophia. They had met in Florence in 1979, married by 1981, raised 3 children in a house with terracotta floors and a lemon tree in the courtyard. And he described it all with the quiet tenderness of a man who had genuinely loved his life, not performed it, not survived it, loved it. I wrote to you once, he said, swirling the last of his wine. The letter came back. After that, he offered a small, helpless shrug. I thought you had moved on. I hoped you had. One letter, one returned envelope. And he had done what any sensible living person would do. He had continued. While I was turning Michael away at the door, kind, patient Michael, who brought tulips and never once raised his voice, Alessandro was already choosing someone else's kitchen, someone else's laughter, someone else's ordinary Tuesday mornings. He hadn't been waiting. He hadn't been preserving anything. He had simply, completely moved on. And in the 50 years I had gilded and guarded and called devotion, they crumbled in my chest like ash dressed up as gold. The house received me the way it always did, without question, without warmth, just the particular quiet of rooms that have been kept too carefully by a woman who confused preservation with devotion. I did not weep for Alessandro, not even a little. What I felt for him had not been love for a very long time. It had been architecture, a structure I built my days around so I wouldn't have to notice what was missing inside them. I wept for Michael, who had sat across from me at dinner for 11 quiet years and never once made me feel like a consolation prize, though I had treated him like one. Michael, who learned how I took my coffee before I ever thought to ask how he took his. Michael, I knew, who left without bitterness, which was somehow the most damning thing of all. I set my bag down on the chair by the door, the chair where his coat used to hang, and I let Alessandro Morelli go. Finally, completely. It cost me almost nothing. That was the worst part. 50 years of faithfulness to a ghost, and the release took less than a breath. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a life that had been waiting patiently for me to arrive and had finally stopped. If Claudette's story touched something in you, a name you haven't said out loud in years, a door you never went back through, a life that kept moving while part of you stood still, then you already know why these stories matter. Don't let this be the last one you find. Subscribe, like, so the next story finds its way to someone who needs it before it's too late for them to hear it.